Welcome back to Void of Fears, where the line between nightmares and reality blurs with every story. Our community grows stronger with each brave soul who joins us. We're 8,000 deep now, creeping toward our goal of 10,000 subscribers by year's end. If you dare to continue this journey with us, hit that subscribe button now. Leave your mark with a like. Share your own encounters in the comments below. Now, let's begin today's story. There are things I've learned that exist in the margins of reality. Things that dwell in the empty spaces between one moment and the next. I know this because it's my job to find them. My name is Thomas Reeves, and I am one of only 7 Chronal Cartographers in the world. We map the boundaries of time, not in the abstract sense that philosophers discuss, but in the literal, physical sense. Time has texture. It has depth and substance. It has weak points, strong points, and occasionally, gaps. Most people live their entire lives without noticing. They experience time as a continuous flow, never realizing there are places where that flow becomes turbulent or stagnant. Places where time pools and eddies like water around a stone. For them, seconds tick by in perfect succession, one after another, in an unbroken chain stretching from birth to death. But that's not how time really works. I've spent the last 11 years mapping temporal anomalies with specialized equipment. Resonance detectors that pick up the vibrations of moments colliding, chronometric anchors that keep us tethered to our own time stream, and devices that can measure the thickness of reality at any given point. It's a strange profession, born from quantum research and fringe science that eventually proved too accurate to ignore. The position found me, rather than the other way around. I was a graduate student studying theoretical physics when I experienced my first temporal slip, a moment where I lived the same 30 seconds twice, aware during the repetition that I'd already experienced it. Most people would have dismissed it as déjà vu, but I recorded it, documented the precise sensations, and published a paper that caught the attention of the Temporal Research Division. Within months, I was recruited. Within a year, I was mapping my first minor anomaly in northern Finland, where locals had reported time skipping like a scratched record. Our team was small, but elite. Dr. Morgan Phillips led our theoretical work. Brilliant, driven, but with a recklessness that should have worried me more than it did. He'd been mapping time longer than anyone, with a reputation for pushing boundaries most researchers wouldn't approach. His silver hair and professorial appearance masked a willingness to risk everything for discovery. Alex Rivera handled our equipment, bringing military precision and a healthy skepticism to our expeditions. Former Special Forces, Rivera had encountered a temporal anomaly during a classified operation in the Ural Mountains. The experience left him with an ability to sense distortions before our instruments could detect them. He never spoke about what he saw during those lost hours, but he carried extra ammunition ever since. Dr. Jasmine Wong's expertise in advanced theoretical physics made her invaluable for interpreting our findings. Soft-spoken but fiercely intelligent, she could translate the abstract readings from our instruments into practical understanding. When she spoke, even Phillips listened. And then there was Taylor Brooks, our newest member, eager, bright, with the kind of enthusiasm that made the rest of us feel ancient in comparison. Fresh from the academy, with top marks and a thesis on temporal elasticity that even I found challenging. Taylor saw our work as adventure rather than science, collecting anomaly readings like trophies. We called ourselves explorers, scientists, pioneers. Now I know better. We were intruders, trespassers in a place we were never meant to find. It began 3 months ago, on what should have been a routine expedition in the North Atlantic. Previous scans had shown minor temporal thinning in the region. Nothing extraordinary, just the kind of minimal variance that occurs naturally throughout the world. But when we arrived, our instruments showed something different. "Thomas, you need to see this." Dr. Phillips's voice crackled through my headset as I calibrated equipment on the deck of our research vessel. The excitement in his tone was unmistakable. I made my way to the lab where Phillips hunched over a monitor, his silver hair catching the blue light of the screen. The temporal density map showed something I'd never seen before. A patch of space where time wasn't just thin, it was practically transparent. "Is the equipment malfunctioning?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. We checked everything twice before departure. "Triple checked," Phillips confirmed, eyes never leaving the screen. "This is real, Thomas, a genuine temporal discontinuity, not just thinning, a gap." I stared at the readout. "That's impossible. Time doesn't just stop." "Not stopped," Phillips corrected, finally looking up at me, with a gleam in his eyes that I would later recognize as dangerous. "Separated. There's something between the moments here." The team gathered that evening to discuss our findings. The ship's conference room buzzed with an energy I hadn't felt since our first major discovery years ago. "The readings suggest a pocket of non-sequential time," Dr. Wong explained, projecting visualizations on the wall. "A space that exists outside normal temporal flow." "Like a bubble between seconds?" Taylor asked, leaning forward. "More like a room between two floors," Wong replied. "It's physically present, but accessible only through very specific means." Rivera, always the pragmatist, voiced what should have been all our concerns. "The protocols for anomalies this severe are clear. We report back and wait for authorization before proceeding." Phillips waved this away. "By the time authorization comes through, this could collapse or move. This is exactly what our team was formed to investigate." "Morgan," I said, using his first name deliberately, "Alex is right. We're not equipped for this level of anomaly." "We're better equipped than anyone else on the planet," he countered. "And you know as well as I do that headquarters will just send another team, probably Ishikawa's group, if we back out. Do you want them getting credit for our discovery?" It was manipulative and effective. Our rivalry with Ishikawa's team was well known, and the prospect of them swooping in grated on all of us. Ishikawa had taken credit for the Bangkok anomaly 3 years earlier, a discovery my instruments had first detected before equipment failure forced us to withdraw. "We should at least wait for the secondary monitoring data," Wong suggested, always the voice of moderation. "Give it 24 hours to confirm stability before we consider direct interaction." Phillips agreed reluctantly, though the gleam in his eyes told me he had already made his decision. We'd be going in, authorization or not. That night, I paced the narrow confines of my cabin, reviewing safety protocols and equipment specifications. Everything we had was designed for observation, not exploration. We were cartographers, not dimensional travelers. The gulf between those roles suddenly seemed vast and dangerous. When I finally slept, I dreamt of drowning in molasses, moving through a thick, resistant medium while something watched from just beyond my vision. A voice that wasn't a voice whispered in frequencies too low and too high simultaneously. I woke gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat despite the cabin's chill. Something about this discovery felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The sea outside my porthole was unnaturally calm, as though the normal physics of wave and wind had been temporarily suspended. I checked my chronometer, 3:37 a.m., but the seconds seemed to tick by with strange hesitation, as though time itself was reluctant to advance. My personal temporal detector, a device I had modified to alert me to local anomalies, showed readings just at the threshold of concern. The anomaly was affecting our surroundings already, bleeding through into our reality even before we attempted entry. Nevertheless, by morning, we had a plan. The monitoring data showed the anomaly was stable, unusually so for a temporal disturbance of this magnitude. We would use modified chronometric anchors to create a stable entry point, then send through a small exploratory team, myself, Phillips, and Rivera, Wong would monitor from the ship while Taylor maintained our equipment. "Remember," Wong cautioned as we made final preparations, "your perception of time may not match reality once you're inside. What feels like minutes could be seconds out here, or vice versa." "That's why we've got the tethers," Rivera said, checking the specialized devices attached to our suits. "These chronometric anchors were designed to keep us synchronized with normal time, or at least provide a way back if we became temporally dislocated." He handed me a standard-issue sidearm, which I initially refused. "Protocol says no weapons during initial contact scenarios," I reminded him. Rivera's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held something I'd never seen before: fear. "Protocol assumes we're dealing with terrestrial anomalies," he said quietly. "This isn't that. Take the weapon." After a moment's hesitation, I accepted it, securing the holster beneath my temporal dampening jacket. The weight felt foreign and unnatural against my ribs. "Stay within visual range of each other at all times," I added to the team. "If anyone starts to experience unusual symptoms, disorientation, memory lapses, visual distortions, we abort immediately." Phillips nodded impatiently. Yes. Can we proceed now?" Taylor approached as we completed our final checks, eyes bright with the excitement of discovery. "I've recalibrated the long-range sensors to track your biosignatures through the anomaly," the young researcher explained. "We should be able to maintain partial monitoring, even if communications fail." "Thanks," I said, patting Taylor's shoulder. "Keep a close eye on those readings. Any fluctuation above 15%. You alert Wong immediately." "Of course," Taylor nodded eagerly. "Good luck in there. Take mental notes for me. I want all the phenomenological details when you get back." The entry process itself defies easy description. We positioned ourselves at the coordinates where our instruments showed the greatest temporal thinning. Using specialized equipment, we amplified the natural variance until it widened enough for physical passage. The sensation was disturbing. Imagine walking through a waterfall, except instead of water, you're passing through the very substance of reality. My skin prickled with static electricity. My ears popped. For one terrible moment, I felt my consciousness stretching, pulling apart like taffy being drawn too thin. I experienced versions of myself, past and potential futures, as simultaneous, overlapping possibilities. In one, I turned back at the last moment, returning to the ship. In another, I stepped forward but arrived wrong, my body reassembling incorrectly. I felt myself dying in that possibility, organs misaligned and failing. I pushed through, forcing myself to focus on the present moment, the actual path rather than the quantum possibilities surrounding it. There was resistance, as though the boundary between normal time and this place actively resisted intrusion. Then we were through. The first thing I noticed was the quality of light. Dim, but not because of darkness. It was as though the light itself was exhausted, traveling too far to reach us with its full intensity. Colors appeared, muted, drained of a vibrancy. Sounds seemed to arrive a fraction of a second after their sources moved, creating a subtle but disorienting delay. We stood on what appeared to be solid ground, though the surface had an unsettling give to it, like walking on memory foam. The landscape around us was barren, but not empty. Strange formations rose in the distance, not quite buildings, not quite natural features. They seemed to shift subtly when viewed peripherally, but remained static when directly observed. The horizon curved unnaturally, suggesting a space that was simultaneously larger and smaller than it appeared. The sky, if it could be called that, wasn't blue or black, but a colour I'd never seen before. Something between purple and green, yet neither of those. Looking at it for too long induced a vertigo that threatened to collapse rational thought. "Incredible," Phillips whispered, his voice simultaneously too loud and too quiet in the strange acoustics. We're actually between moments. Rivera checked his instruments. Anchor signals are stable. Main timeline is registering as approximately 3 meters up from our position. The spatial metaphor was necessary, though not entirely accurate. The normal flow of time wasn't physically above us, but the human mind needs to organize such concepts spatially to comprehend them. Let's establish a base perimeter, I suggested, activating the portable anchor beacons. We placed them in a triangular formation, creating a zone that maintains stronger connection to our native time stream. The air, though I don't know if air is the right word for what we breathed there, had a taste like copper and ozone. Each breath felt somehow significant, as though the act of respiration itself was different here, each inhalation drawing in not just oxygen, but moments themselves. As we worked, I noticed something odd about our movements. Occasionally an action would seem to precede its cause. Rivera reaching for a tool before I asked for it. Phillips answering questions I hadn't yet vocalized. These moments were brief and easily dismissed as déjà vu, but their frequency was troubling. Time isn't linear here, Phillips observed, noticing my discomfort. It pools and swirls. Don't worry about it. But there was plenty to worry about. Our equipment behaved erratically. Readings fluctuated wildly. Batteries drained and recharged without explanation, and compasses spun in continuous circles. More disturbing were the echoes, snippets of conversations we hadn't yet had, footprints appearing before we walked a path, and brief glimpses of ourselves standing in places we hadn't visited. This is normal for a non-sequential environment, Phillips assured us, though nothing about this place felt normal. We're experiencing time from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Rivera remained silent, his military training evident in the way he continuously scanned our surroundings, his posture tense and ready. I noticed he'd positioned himself so his back was never to the strange horizon. Test the communications, I suggested, attempting to re-establish some sense of normal procedure. Phillips activated his link to the ship. Base, this is exploration team. Do you copy? Wong's voice came through, distorted and stretched like taffy. We receiving signal quality, fluctuating. Temporal distortion affecting the transmission, I noted, adjusting settings on my own communicator. Try narrowing the frequency band. After several attempts, we established tenuous communication, though with significant time dilation. Words we spoke arrived at the ship minutes later from their perspective, while their responses reached us seconds after being sent. Fascinating, Phillips muttered. Time is flowing at different rates between here and normal space. We could spend days here and return to find only hours have passed. Or the opposite, Rivera pointed out grimly. We could think we've been here minutes and return to find years gone by. After establishing our base, we began careful exploration in widening circles. Rivera marked our path with specialized markers, designed to exist concurrently in multiple moments, ensuring we could find our way back regardless of temporal shifts. The landscape defied consistent mapping. Features appeared and disappeared as we approached them, not vanishing, but rather seeming to shift between states of existence. A rock formation might be solid when observed directly, then reveal itself as mist when touched, only to remanifest as crystal several feet away, moments later. It's like the environment can't decide what it wants to be, I observed, recording readings from a particularly unstable region where matter seemed to cycle through different states. Or it's being all possibilities simultaneously, and our perception is simply catching different versions, Phillips suggested, quantum uncertainty made manifest. It was during our third expedition loop that we first noticed we weren't alone. The entities, I hesitate to call them creatures, didn't appear suddenly. Rather, I slowly became aware they had been present all along, like noticing a pattern in static that had always been there. They seemed to observe us from the edges of perception, never fully materializing but never completely absent. "Do you see that?" I asked, nodding toward a rippling distortion about 50 yards away. Rivera tensed, his hand moving to the sidearm he'd insisted on bringing. "Affirmative, 2 o'clock moving parallel to our position." The distortion wavered, like heat mirage, occasionally suggesting a form within. Something elongated and fluid, moving with purpose but in patterns that made no biological sense. It maintained consistent distance, matching our pace precisely. "There's another one," Rivera murmured, indicating the opposite direction. "We're being flanked." Phillips showed no concern. "Temporal residents. They're curious about us, that's all." "You knew they were here?" I demanded. He shrugged. "I speculated. Every environment has inhabitants, adapted to its conditions." "These conditions aren't supposed to exist," Rivera pointed out. "Nothing should be able to live between moments." Phillips smiled in a way that would later haunt me. And yet, here they are. Isn't that fascinating? The distortions maintained their distance throughout our initial surveys. I tried to capture images with our specialized cameras, but the results were disappointing. Blurry suggestions of movement. Nothing concrete enough for proper analysis. They exist partially out of phase with our perceptual capabilities, Phillips explained when I showed him the footage. "We're trying to observe 4-dimensional beings with 3-dimensional senses." "You seem to know an awful lot about them," Rivera noted, suspicion evident in his tone. Phillips ignored the implication. "Theoretical modeling, that's all. I've published papers on potential nonlinear life forms." We continued our exploration with greater caution, documenting everything through specialized cameras and sensors. The deeper we ventured, the more pronounced the temporal distortions became. In some areas, we experienced time at different rates. Rivera aged noticeably during a period that felt like minutes to me, while Phillips reported the same interval as feeling like hours. "This is unprecedented," Phillips said, examining Rivera's readings, localized temporal bubbles within the larger anomaly. Rivera ran his hand over his face, feeling the stubble that hadn't been there minutes before. "How long was that for you?" he asked me. "Maybe 10 minutes, I replied, checking my chronometer, which had stopped functioning entirely. 6 hours, he said flatly. "I experienced 6 hours. I was alone, walking through this place, looking for you two. Neither of you would answer your comms." Phillips and I exchanged concerned glances. "We never lost sight of you," I told him. "You were right beside us the whole time." Rivera's expression darkened. "I saw things during those hours, things watching us that aren't just curious." "What things?" I pressed. "The residents," he answered, using Phillips' term with obvious distaste. "They were studying something, parts of something. I think it might have been human once." Phillips dismissed Rivera's experience as a hallucination induced by temporal distortion, but I noticed he increased the frequency of our check-ins after that, as though suddenly more concerned about potential separation. On our 4th day, according to my chronometer, though Phillips insisted it had been 6 days and Rivera believed it was only 2, we discovered the structures. They rose from the hazy landscape like ancient monuments, but their form defied conventional architecture. Surfaces curved in ways that suggested they extended into dimensions beyond our perception. Materials appeared simultaneously solid and fluid, ancient and new. Most disturbing were the symbols etched into their surfaces, characters that rearranged themselves when not directly observed. "This proves intelligence," Phillips declared triumphantly, circling one of the smaller structures. "These weren't formed naturally, they were built." The largest structure resembled a tower, the one that seemed to extend sideways through time, rather than upward through space. Standing before it, I experienced vertiginous glimpses of its past and future states, sometimes crumbling ruin, sometimes pristine monument, sometimes something still under construction by entities I could almost perceive. "By what?" Rivera asked, the edge in his voice growing sharper. By the residents, obviously, Phillips replied. They're not just curious animals, they're sentient. Rivera studied the symbols with growing unease. These look familiar somehow. Impossible, Phillips scoffed. No human has encountered these before. Not what I meant, Rivera replied. They remind me of something I saw during a classified operation. Symbols that shouldn't exist on Earth, but did. This caught Phillips's attention. Where exactly was this operation? Rivera hesitated, clearly weighing his security clearance against our current situation. Northern Siberia. A research station reported anomalous findings, then went silent. We were sent to investigate. What did you find? I asked. Everyone dead, he answered flatly, but not recently. They'd been dead for decades, despite the mission being only 3 days old when we arrived, and everything was covered in symbols like these. In the central area of these structures, we found what appeared to be a mechanism, an intricate arrangement of components that moved in patterns reminiscent of clockwork, though with movements that occasionally reversed or paused. Phillips became obsessed with it, insisting it was some sort of temporal regulator or map. The mechanism occupied the center of a circular chamber within the largest structure. It consisted of concentric rings of material that resembled burnished metal, but flowed like liquid, each rotating at different speeds and sometimes in different directions simultaneously. At the center, a pulsing core emitted the same strange, not quite light that permeated the entire realm. This is it, Phillips whispered reverently. This is how they navigate the time streams. It's a map, Thomas. A map of all time. I was less convinced. It could be anything. A power source, a communication device. No, look at the patterns, he insisted, pointing to movements within the mechanism. That's the Mesozoic era there. See how it cycles? And that represents the current epoch. It's showing temporal relationships. Whether he was right or projecting, the mechanism was clearly important. The surrounding chamber was more elaborately decorated than any other structure we'd encountered, with the shifting symbols particularly dense along the walls. Can you decipher any of it? I asked. Phillips shook his head. Not yet, but with time and proper analysis. His eyes never left the mechanism, his expression like a man in a religious trance. We should have left then. Every protocol, every safety guideline demanded we retreat and report our findings. But Phillips was adamant that we needed more data, more understanding, and I, to my eternal regret, allowed his enthusiasm to override my caution. One more day, I conceded. We collect as much data as possible, then we return to base and file a full report. Phillips agreed readily, though in retrospect, I doubt he ever intended to leave. That night, or what passed for night in that timeless place, our team expanded to include Wong and Taylor, who joined us through our stabilized entry point. They brought additional equipment and supplies, allowing us to extend our mission. Wong emerged from the entry point with remarkable composure, pausing only momentarily to adjust to the strange environment. Taylor followed with boundless enthusiasm, immediately activating recording devices and exclaiming over the alien landscape. "This is unprecedented," Wong breathed as she took in the alien landscape. "The implications for our understanding of physics are extraordinary." She approached one of the shifting objects nearby, something like a boulder that continually transformed between states of matter. With careful precision, she set up monitoring equipment to record its fluctuations. "The barriers between potential states have collapsed here," she explained. "Matter exists in all possible configurations simultaneously, only appearing to choose a specific form when observed." Taylor's eyes were wide with wonder. "It's beautiful in a strange way." The young researcher moved with surprising confidence through the alien environment, setting up additional instruments and collecting samples of the not-quite matter that comprised this place. Only Rivera seemed to share my growing unease. "We shouldn't bring more people in until we understand what we're dealing with," he muttered as we unloaded the new equipment. "We need Wong's expertise to interpret these structures," I responded, though I knew he was right. "And Taylor, the kid has no business in a temporal anomaly this severe." I had no good answer for that. Taylor's inclusion had been Phillips's decision, overriding my objections. With our expanded team, we established a more permanent research station near the central mechanism. Wong quickly confirmed our suspicions about the intelligence behind the structures. "These patterns aren't random," she explained, pointing to the shifting symbols. "They're communicating something, data about temporal flows, perhaps. And this mechanism, it's monitoring something, maybe even controlling it." Taylor approached the investigation with unbridled enthusiasm, documenting every aspect of our discoveries and developing new theories about the nature of the place with remarkable speed. "I think it's a nexus," Taylor proposed over our evening meal, nutrient packets that tasted strangely metallic in this environment. Not just the gap between moments, but a connection point for multiple time streams, like a temporal hub. Phillips nodded approvingly. "Exactly what I've been thinking. A junction in the architecture of time itself." "Which raises the question," Wong interjected thoughtfully. "Why here? Why this location?" None of us had a satisfactory answer, though Phillips suggested it might relate to electromagnetic abnormalities in the region that had been documented for centuries. As our research progressed, I noticed subtle changes in our team. Phillips grew increasingly possessive of the central mechanism, spending hours observing its movements and making cryptic notes. Wong became unnaturally focused on the shifting symbols, attempting to develop a translation algorithm with obsessive dedication. Taylor's enthusiasm took on a feverish quality, the young researcher sleeping less and talking more rapidly, connections between ideas becoming increasingly tenuous. Only Rivera seemed immune to the place's influence, his military discipline providing a psychological anchor that the rest of us lacked. He established strict rotation schedules for rest periods and insisted on regular equipment checks that helped maintain some semblance of normal procedure. On the second day after Wong and Taylor's arrival, I experienced my first significant temporal slippage. While examining one of the smaller structures, I suddenly found myself in darkness, alone in what seemed to be the same location but at a different time. The structures around me were older, decaying, and the ambient light had dimmed to near blackness. More disturbing were the glimpses of movement in that darkness. Forms that recalled the distortions we'd observed, but more substantial, more purposeful. They moved through the ruins with familiarity, gathering around a spot where I somehow knew my team would later establish our base camp. The experience lasted subjectively for hours, though when I returned to normal temporal alignment, Rivera informed me I'd been standing motionless for approximately 20 seconds. "You were gone," he said simply. "Your eyes were open, but you weren't there." I described my experience to the team, but only Rivera showed appropriate concern. Phillips and Wong dismissed it as a hallucination, while Taylor seemed almost envious. "Time tourism," Taylor called it excitedly. "Your consciousness temporally shifted to a different temporal alignment. Do you think it was the past or the future?" "Neither," I replied, unable to articulate the profound wrongness of what I'd seen. "It was outside, like looking at this place from a different angle entirely." Our breakthrough came at a terrible price. Taylor was documenting one of the smaller structures when a ripple passed through our area, a temporal shift more severe than any we'd experienced. When it subsided, Taylor was gone. The search effort was frantic. We split into pairs, using our anchors to maintain connections as we combed outward from the base. Hours stretched with no sign, until Rivera called over the radio. "I found Taylor's equipment," he reported grimly. "No sign of the kid." We converged on his location to find Taylor's backpack, chronometer, and recording devices scattered as if dropped in a hurry. More disturbing was what we found among the equipment: Taylor's journal containing an entry dated 3 days in the future, written in Taylor's handwriting. "Someone will come for me soon. They've explained that I'm needed elsewhere in the stream. Don't worry about me. I'm seeing everything now." The handwriting started normally but deteriorated throughout the entry, the final words scrawled in an almost frantic hand that trailed off the page. Phillips insisted it was proof Taylor was alive, just displaced in time. Rivera argued it could be a fabrication, a lure to separate us further. Wong suggested it might be genuine, but influenced by whatever had taken Taylor. I kept my worst fears to myself, that perhaps all these explanations were simultaneously true, in this place where time had no fixed meaning. "We need to leave," Rivera stated flatly, "now, before we lose anyone else." For once, Wong agreed immediately. "He's right, we're not equipped for this. We need to report what we've found and return with a larger team and better safeguards." Phillips alone resisted. "We can't abandon Taylor, and we've barely scratched the surface of what this place can teach us." "Morgan," I said firmly, "we've lost contact with a team member. Protocol is absolutely clear. We withdraw and reassess." After heated debate, Phillips reluctantly agreed to begin preparations for departure the following morning, allowing time to collect critical data and samples before withdrawal. That evening, huddled in our base camp, the entity made itself known. Unlike the peripheral observers we'd glimpsed before, this presence manifested with purpose and focus. It began as a distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. Then it coalesced into something more substantial, a form that seemed to exist in multiple states at once, constantly shifting, yet maintaining a central cohesion. I won't describe its appearance in detail, not because it was horrifying in the conventional sense, though it certainly violated every natural law I understood, but because any description would be incomplete. It existed across multiple moments simultaneously, parts of it occupying different points in time. "Don't move," Phillips whispered, though none of us could have fled if we wanted to. Some force, not physical restraint, but something more fundamental, held us in place. Rivera's hand moved incrementally towards his weapon, but even that small action seemed to require enormous effort, as though he was pushing against the very fabric of time itself. The entity circled our group, moving with fluid grace. When it communicated, it wasn't through sound but through images and sensations implanted directly into our minds. I perceived flashes of other times, other places, some recognizable as historical events, others completely alien. I saw dinosaurs roaming pristine forests, then the same forests burning as the KT asteroid struck. I witnessed human civilizations rising and falling in rapid succession, then strange cities populated by beings that resembled humans but weren't quite. I experienced ice ages and warming periods, the birth and death of stars, all compressed into moments of perception that threatened to overwhelm my consciousness. Beneath these visions lay something more disturbing, a clinical curiosity, an intelligence observing reactions and cataloguing responses. I felt like a bacterium under a microscope, being prodded to see what I would do. Phillips stepped forward, arms raised in what looked like supplication. "We mean no harm," he said. "We're explorers, scientists." The entity paused, focusing its attention on him. A series of impressions flooded my mind. Curiosity, assessment, and something that felt disturbingly like hunger. "It's interested in our world," Wong whispered. "It's asking about our time stream." The impressions shifted, becoming more specific. Images of Earth, human cities, technology, all observed with the detached interest of a collector evaluating potential specimens. Phillips began to explain, describing our reality with growing animation. I watched in horror as he offered the entity information about our world, our time, our people, information that felt dangerous to share. "Morgan, stop," I hissed. "Protocol states no information exchange without authorization." He ignored me, continuing his one-sided conversation with increasing fervor. The entity's attention remained fixed on him, the impressions flowing between them now too rapid for me to intercept. Rivera managed to shift his position slightly, placing himself between the entity and Wong. "Don't engage," he murmured to her. "Don't offer anything." After what seemed like hours, but might have been minutes, the entity withdrew, its form dissipating like fog under morning sun. The oppressive force holding us in place vanished with it, leaving us gasping as though we'd been holding our breath. Philip stood transfixed, staring at the empty space where the entity had been. His expression was one of rapture and revelation. "Did you see?" he whispered. "Did you understand what it showed me?" None of us answered. Wong was shaking, her usual composure shattered. Rivera immediately began checking our perimeter and equipment, his movements sharp with tension. That night, after the entity withdrew, I confronted Phillips in private. "What were you thinking? We have no idea what that thing's intentions are." Phillips's eyes gleamed with the same fanatic light I'd first seen when we discovered the anomaly. "It's a temporal native, Thomas. Do you understand what that means? It experiences all of time simultaneously, past, present, future, all accessible." "That doesn't mean we should be sharing information about our world," I argued. "Knowledge exchange is the foundation of scientific progress," he countered. "Besides, I've had contact with them before." The admission hit me like a physical blow. "What?" Philip sighed, suddenly looking tired. "There was another expedition, 2 years ago, classified even from most of our department. We found a smaller anomaly in Antarctica, made brief contact." "And you didn't think this was relevant information to share before we entered a temporal gap?" "Would you have come if I had?" he challenged. "Would headquarters have authorized this mission if they knew the full extent of what happened last time?" The implications were clear. Something had gone wrong previously, something serious enough to be buried in classified files. "How many died, Morgan?" I asked quietly. He looked away. 3. But that was different. We weren't prepared then. We didn't understand what we were dealing with." "And you think you understand now?" I gestured to the alien landscape around us. "Taylor is missing. Our equipment is failing. That thing out there isn't some benevolent entity willing to share temporal secrets." "You're wrong," Phillips insisted. "They're merely curious. They want to understand us as much as we want to understand them." "Is that why Taylor disappeared?" "Curiosity." A shadow crossed Phillips's face. "Taylor may have been overeager. Approached them without proper preparation." "You encouraged that eagerness," I accused. "You specifically requested Taylor for this mission, despite my recommendation for someone with more experience." Phillips didn't deny it. Taylor had the right mindset. Open, receptive, without the bureaucratic caution that holds back true discovery. "That bureaucratic caution exists for a reason," I countered. "Look what happened to your last team." His expression hardened. "This conversation is over. We continue as planned. Tomorrow we'll conduct further investigations of the central mechanism." "We're leaving tomorrow," I reminded him. "As agreed. After we complete essential documentation," he qualified, turning away to end the discussion. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I reviewed our data, looking for patterns I might have missed. What I found disturbed me deeply. Our readings showed the anomaly was expanding, slowly but steadily growing wider. The gap between moments was increasing, and our presence seemed to be accelerating the process. The data showed clear correlation between our activities and anomaly growth. Each time we activated certain equipment, each sample we collected, each interaction with the structures, all corresponded with micro-expansions of the temporal gap. We weren't just observers, we were catalysts, widening the breach between time streams. More concerning were the energy signatures emanating from the central mechanism. They had increased by 37% since our arrival, and showed no signs of stabilizing. If the trend continued, the anomaly would expand beyond our ability to close it within days. I compiled the evidence into a report, intending to present it to the team in the morning as further justification for immediate withdrawal. As I worked, I noticed subtle distortions in the air around me, the now familiar signs of temporal thinning. Our base camp itself was becoming less anchored to normal time. The next morning, Wong made a discovery that changed everything. "Look at these," she said, showing me a collection of artifacts we'd gathered from different areas. I thought they were just debris, but look closer. The items were man-made: a pocket watch from approximately the 1890s, a military dog tag dated 1943, a digital camera that appeared to be contemporary. All items that had no business being in this timeless place. People have been coming here before us, I realized, for centuries. Not just coming here, Wong corrected grimly, being brought here. She activated a tablet containing her latest analysis. I've been studying the patterns in the symbol sequences on the structures. They're not just writing, they're records. Each grouping corresponds to a collection event. "Collection?" Rivera asked, joining our conversation. Wong nodded soberly. "I believe these entities have been bringing humans into this place throughout history. These artifacts are leftovers." "For what purpose?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "Study," she replied. "Examination. The same reason we collect specimens." Further exploration uncovered more evidence: journal fragments from explorers dating back centuries, personal effects from various eras, all abandoned in this timeless realm. Some contained desperate entries describing being harvested or collected. One journal fragment from what appeared to be an 18th century naval officer described being observed by beings of mist and shadow who take apart the hours of a man's life and examine them like watchmakers with gears. A more recent note, written on paper bearing a Soviet military watermark, described dissection of time itself. They pull moments from you like organs, preserving them in glass containers that exist nowhere and everywhere. When we returned to base camp with our findings, Phillips was gone. "He took the primary chronometric anchor," Rivera reported, checking our supplies, "and the temporal scanner." "Why would he—" I began, then stopped as the realization hit me. "He's making a deal." "What kind of deal?" Wong asked. "The kind that gets the rest of us killed," Rivera answered grimly, checking his weapon. I shared my data on the expanding anomaly. He knows this place is growing, becoming more unstable. He's probably trying to ensure his own escape, or secure access to whatever knowledge these entities possess, Wong concluded, even at our expense. We attempted to track Phillips through the strange environment, but normal tracking methods were useless in a place where time folded back on itself. Eventually, we decided our priority had to be securing our own escape before our remaining anchors failed. If we reconfigure the backup anchors, we might generate enough stability for extraction, Wong suggested, already beginning calculations. "How long?" Rivera asked, maintaining watch on our perimeter. 6 hours, maybe 7, she replied, assuming no further temporal degradation. That's when our equipment began to malfunction systematically. Batteries died, circuits fried. The temporal tethers connecting us to our original time stream weakened. "This isn't random failure," Rivera determined, after examining the equipment. "This is sabotage." "Phillips," Wong concluded. "He doesn't want us to leave." As we worked desperately to repair our temporal tether, the environment around us deteriorated. The already unstable temporal field began to fragment further. We experienced disturbing slippages. Moments where we saw versions of ourselves from hours ago or ahead. Glimpses of potential futures where we appeared injured or worse. In one particularly disturbing incident, I saw myself standing near one of the alien structures covered in a substance that resembled black oil, my eyes completely dark as I conversed with the entity. When I blinked, the vision was gone, but the implication remained. "The boundary is collapsing completely," Wong announced, checking readings on our one remaining functional sensor. "We need to leave in the next hour, or we might not leave at all." After hours of work, Rivera managed to establish a weak connection to our entry point. "It won't hold for long," he warned, "and it can probably only transport 3 of us." "That's all of us," Wong pointed out. Rivera shook his head. "Someone needs to maintain the field from this side until the others are through, then make a final attempt." The implication was clear. Whoever stayed behind faced significantly reduced odds of successful extraction. "I'll stay," I volunteered. "I have the most experience with temporal equipment." "With respect, sir," Rivera countered, "I'm more expendable. You and Wong need to report what we've found. Make sure this place gets quarantined properly." Before we could argue further, Phillips returned, but not alone. The entity accompanied him, more substantial now, its presence distorting the air around it. "Step away from the equipment," Phillips commanded, his voice eerily calm. "Nobody's leaving." He looked different, aged somehow, though not physically. His eyes held a strange depth, as though he was seeing through multiple layers of time simultaneously. "Morgan, what have you done?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I've secured our future," he replied. "They've shown me everything, Thomas, the whole of time laid out like a map. Do you know what that's worth? What we could accomplish with that knowledge?" "And what did you promise in return?" Rivera demanded, his hand moving subtly towards his weapon. Phillips smiled. "Access. They're curious about us, about linear beings who experience time as a progression. They want to observe more of our kind." "They've been taking people throughout history," Wong said. "That's what all these artifacts mean. They're collectors, and we're the specimens." "Observers," Phillips corrected. "Scientists like us." The entity shifted, its form becoming momentarily more defined before flowing back into temporal flux. Impressions flooded my mind. Images of humans in different states of temporal displacement, their moments pulled apart and examined. "Morgan," I said carefully, "what happened to Taylor?" Something flickered in Phillips's eyes, a moment of doubt quickly suppressed, a necessary contribution to our understanding. Taylor's experiencing time from their perspective now. The entity pulsed, and I caught a glimpse of Taylor, or what had been Taylor. The young researcher floated, suspended, in a space that wasn't quite space, body intact but somehow separated from the moments that composed a complete existence. Taylor's consciousness was stretched across different time streams, experiencing past, present, and future simultaneously with no ability to process the input. A living temporal specimen, pinned like a butterfly to a collection board. Rivera moved suddenly, drawing his weapon and firing at the entity. The bullet seemed to pass through it with no effect, disappearing into temporal distortions. The entity's response was immediate and terrifying. The space around us warped, reality itself seeming to fold and unfold. Rivera was lifted from the ground, his body suspended, as though time had stopped for him alone. "Don't!" Phillips shouted, but whether to Rivera or the entity, I couldn't tell. What followed was chaos. Wong rushed to the temporal tether controls, activating the emergency return sequence. The entity moved toward her with frightening speed, but Phillips unexpectedly stepped between them. "Not her," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "That wasn't our arrangement." The momentary distraction gave me time to reach Rivera, who hung suspended in the air. As I touched him, time resumed for his body, and he collapsed to the ground. "Get to the tether," I ordered. pulling him towards the shimmering portal Wong had activated. The entity's attention shifted to me, and I experienced a mental assault of images. Taylor stretched across different time streams, previous explorers dissected through temporal means, Phillips himself observed across multiple potential futures. "It sees us as lab rats," Rivera gasped as we stumbled toward the portal. Wong had the tether stabilized, but it flickered dangerously. "It's collapsing," she shouted. "We have maybe 30 seconds." The entity flowed toward us, its form expanding to block our escape. Phillips stood frozen between us and the entity, his expression conflicted. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes, realization of what he had truly bargained with. "Thomas, you don't understand. They can show us everything, the whole of time." "At what cost?" I demanded. "Look what they did to Taylor, to the others before us." A shudder ran through Phillips. For a moment, I saw clarity return to his eyes. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll hold it back." None of us believed him. Rivera reached the portal first, with me close behind. Wong hesitated, looking back at Phillips. "Jasmine, come on," I shouted. The entity surged forward. Wong made her decision, pushing me through the portal while holding the stabilizer. "Keep it open from your side," she called, turning back to face the advancing presence. The last thing I saw before the temporal current pulled me away was Wong standing firm, manipulating the controls as the entity engulfed her. Phillips reached toward her, his face a mask of horror and regret as he realized the true nature of what he'd unleashed. The return transition was worse than the entry. My consciousness seemed to fragment, pieces of my awareness scattered across multiple moments before painfully reassembling. I emerged gasping on the deck of our research vessel, Rivera materializing seconds later. Wong never appeared. The ship's crew reported that we'd been gone for 3 weeks, though it had felt like days to us. The temporal anomaly had collapsed completely, vanishing from their instruments shortly after our return. "What about Taylor and Dr. Wong? And Dr. Phillips?" the expedition coordinator asked during our initial debriefing. "Lost," Rivera answered before I could formulate a response. "Equipment malfunction, temporal displacement. They're gone." His eyes met mine, conveying a clear message. The truth would never be believed, and might well result in our indefinite detention for psychiatric evaluation. He was right. Nobody believed our story. The official report classified the incident as equipment malfunction, combined with environmental hallucinosis from experimental technology. Phillips, Wong, and Taylor were listed as lost at sea during equipment testing. Rivera and I were placed on extended medical leave, required to attend psychiatric evaluations. But I know what we saw, what we experienced, and I know that our return didn't end it. Time isn't right for me anymore. I experience moments out of sequence, future events briefly superimposing over present reality, memories replaying as though they're happening now. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the entity in reflections, or shadows watching me with its alien attention. Last Monday I experienced an entire conversation with my apartment manager about a water leak before it actually happened. When it occurred for real on Thursday, every word was identical. Yesterday I saw my neighbour's child riding a bicycle outside my window, the same child who died in an accident 3 years ago. Reality shifts around me in subtle ways. Street names change overnight. People I've known for years suddenly have different histories, different personalities. The world feels increasingly thin, as though the barriers between possible timelines are wearing away. More disturbing are the messages from Rivera. They arrive in impossible ways. Notes in my handwriting that I never wrote. Recordings on my phone that appear without explanation. They're dated from different years, different decades, but all contain the same desperate warning. They're finding more ways through. One note, apparently from Rivera in 2028, described temporal breaches appearing in major cities worldwide. Another, dated 1978, detailed his efforts to close a rift in rural Montana before they could fully emerge. The most disturbing, bearing next month's date, simply read, "Phillips is helping them, not willingly anymore. They're wearing him like a suit." I've tried to alert the authorities, but who would believe me? The department has buried the incident, all records classified or destroyed. The remaining Chronal Cartographers have been reassigned to safer projects, mapping minor fluctuations with severely limited equipment. But the thinning continues. I can feel it now, places where time stretches too thin, where the barriers between moments weaken. They're appearing worldwide, small pinpricks in the fabric of reality. Most people will never notice, but I've been changed by my time in that place. I can sense the weak spots forming. Last week, I travelled to a location in the Arizona desert where my instruments detected a significant temporal variance. There, in a remote canyon, I found a rancher staring at a patch of air that rippled like heat waves. He told me his cattle refused to approach the spot, and sometimes objects placed near it would disappear, only to reappear hours or days later in slightly different locations. Been happening about 6 months now, he explained. Started small, but it's growing. I took readings that confirmed my fears. Another gap forming, another potential entry point for the entities. Sometimes I wonder if I truly escaped, or if I'm still there, experiencing an elaborate scenario the entity created to study my reactions. Other times I fear something worse, that I brought part of it back with me, embedded in my consciousness like a parasite. My memories have begun changing. Events I lived through now seem different in recollection. People I've known for years suddenly have histories I don't recognize. The world itself appears subtly altered, brand names slightly changed, historical events with different outcomes than I remember. The memorial in my hometown park commemorates a different war than the one I recall from childhood. Am I losing my mind? Or is my reality being unraveled thread by thread? 2 nights ago, I woke to find the air in my bedroom rippling with familiar distortion. For several minutes I lay paralyzed as a presence I couldn't quite see moved around my bed, studying me with patient, alien curiosity. It left no physical evidence, but in the morning, I discovered the digital clock by my bed was running backward. 3 days ago, I received a final message from Rivera. Unlike the others, this one came conventionally. A letter with a current postmark, written in clearly distressed handwriting. It's using Phillips to find more of us. I've seen him in Chicago, New York, London, places he couldn't possibly be simultaneously. It's wearing him like a suit, Thomas, and I think it wants to do the same with us. I'm going off-grid. You should too. It gets stronger every time it crosses over. The letter included coordinates to a remote location and instructions for a meeting 1 month from now, along with specifications for a device that might provide temporary protection from temporal detection. I've packed what I need, equipment salvaged from our expedition, modified to detect temporal thinning. I've constructed Rivera's device, a strange amalgamation of chronometric components that emits a field theoretically capable of stabilizing local time. Tonight I leave everything behind. My apartment, my identity, my former life. I don't know if I'm running away or towards something. Perhaps both simultaneously in this new reality where time no longer moves in a straight line for me. Before departing, I'm leaving this record. A warning to anyone who might follow in our footsteps. The temporal boundaries are weakening worldwide. What lives between moment is finding ways to enter our time stream. And they are not, as Phillips initially believed, merely curious observers. They are harvesters, collectors. They study us by taking us apart, not physically but temporally. They separate the moments of our existence and examine them in isolation, with no more concern for our experience than we show for cells under a microscope. All I know is that we found something between times, something ancient and patient and hungry. We opened a door that was meant to stay closed, and now I feel it watching me, waiting in the spaces between one moment and the next, waiting for the right moment to pull me back. Last night, I thought I glimpsed Taylor on a busy street, just for a second before the figure vanished into the crowd. The face was Taylor's, but the eyes were wrong. Too deep, too knowing, as though looking at me from across the entire expanse of time. I am a chronal cartographer. I map the boundaries of time, and I've discovered that some boundaries should never be crossed. As I prepare to leave, I notice the shadows in my apartment behaving strangely, stretching in ways that defy the light sources casting them. The air feels heavy, pregnant with potential. My chronometer is displaying impossible readings, the seconds ticking by in irregular patterns. They're coming. Perhaps they've always been here, watching from the margins of moments, waiting for someone to notice them, to give them a way in. If you're reading this and you sense something wrong with time around you, moments that don't flow quite right, memories that shift, a persistent feeling of being observed from just beyond perception, run. Don't look back. Don't try to understand. Some knowledge isn't meant for linear beings like us. Some places aren't meant to be mapped. And if you ever meet someone claiming to be Dr. Morgan Phillips, or Dr. Jasmine Wong, or a researcher named Taylor Brooks, or even me, walk away immediately. What wears their faces isn't them anymore. It's what lives between times, wearing us like suits, learning to exist in a world of linear moments. And it's getting better at pretending to be us with each passing day.